Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. Ice. We take it for granted. If an ice cube melts, well, we just get another one out of the freezer. But it wasn't always like that. Ice used to be, in fact, an incredibly precious commodity. That's in the days before refrigerators and freezers were a thing, and Connecticut played its role in the supply of ice as well. Well, here to talk about that today is James Fischer. He's the research director at the White Memorial Conservation Center in Litchfield, Connecticut, on the banks of beautiful Bantam Lake, Connecticut's largest natural lake. Well, at their 4,000-acre nature preserve also sits the remnants of a once thriving ice harvesting operation. James will be along in a moment, and wait until you hear what he knows about this subject. This week's trivia question: it's in Northeast Connecticut, it's about 100 miles long, and Connecticut, frankly, wouldn't be here without it. Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. Yale New Haven Hospital was the very first hospital in Connecticut. They opened their doors 200 years ago and later introduced the entire country to the use of penicillin and chemotherapy. Today, some of the brightest minds in medicine choose to work there, and it's the primary teaching hospital for the prestigious Yale School of Medicine. For more information, log on to ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. There's a marketing term for restaurants that's been around for a little while now. It's farm to table, and it means exactly what it says, of course. Farmers grow the produce locally, and then it's served to you at the table at a nearby restaurant. Great concept. Popularity continues to grow. Today we're going to do a little bit of an offshoot. Lake to icebox. That's right, huge chunks of ice from a frozen lake, harvested, stored, shipped, and then delivered to your icebox. That's something that Connecticut had as late as the 1950s, and all this, of course, before electricity and refrigeration were in our vernacular. Well, Connecticut played a big role in supplying ice because, of course, its climate meant that lakes and ponds froze during the winter. There were small operations all over the state. In fact, wherever there was a pond or a small lake in a rural area without electricity, ice was needed, and those small operations dealt with the local and regional demand. And then there were these much larger operations that existed at a couple of locations, operations that shipped ice out of state, as a matter of fact. The Congamon Lakes was one such operation on the Connecticut-Massachusetts border, and another operation that wasn't quite as big as that was the former Berkshire Ice Company business. It was on Bantam Lake. Now, that's in the beautiful northwest hills of Connecticut, nestled between Bantam, which is part of Litchfield, and Morris. They called it ice harvesting because for 150 years in the U.S., ice was actually harvested just like a farmer's crops, except, of course, during the winter months when the farms were idle. The White Memorial Conservation Center is a 4,000-acre wildlife preserve and is located in the Bantam section of the town of Litchfield on Bantam Lake. Now, the land was donated by the brother-sister team of Elaine and May White more than 100 years ago. Part of the land they donated used to belong to their neighbors, the Berkshire Ice Company. Well, it went out of business in the 1920s and made the land available to the Whites to purchase. And our guest today is the research director for the Conservation Center, James Fischer. James, what I was impressed by, we walked around the site here before we started recording, and it's so clear how knowledgeable you are in nature and just in general, and all the different things you could point out and talk about knowledgeably. And on top of this, they left you the ruins of an ice house, the Berkshire Ice House, and you have become an incredible historian. I spend a lot of time studying history, and you're rattling off parts that I know about and I've heard about as if it's second nature to you. So is this a hobby for you now, or is this part of the job?
Well, it's a little bit of both, actually. We've had a lot of strong local interest in what those ice house operation was. What are those old foundations? They kind of stick out like a sore thumb. A lot of people have lots of questions. And so we had some vague understanding of what was out there. But we had a local historian who really nudged us along, Lee Swift. She sort of said, hey, why don't we clear some of that vegetation around the ice house operation and see if we can open it up a little bit more so people can get a clearer understanding. And so we did. And that opened up all kinds of new questions for us. And so we then started hosting programs that introduced people to the kinds of tools that these men were using. Why was ice so important? And getting at the ins and outs of this big, huge, monstrous operation that had occurred in the early 1900s.
Now, Bantam Lake is the largest natural lake in the state of Connecticut. There's also Candlewood Lake, Lake Zor, and Lake Lunona, and all of those were the result of energy company projects to dam up rivers. But Bantam is the largest lake in the state of Connecticut. And when I first started hearing about ice harvesting, how do you cut into a 950-acre lake and harvest all that ice without sometime falling in? And you gave me the secret answer, which was they didn't harvest the entire lake.
Right. So the big ice house was trying to harvest about 40 acres of ice each winter. And that would give them about 40,000 tons of ice per winter. That seems like a lot, but the ice house itself was able to store 60,000 tons of ice. And so that allowed the company to manage the amount of ice that was being distributed so that if there was a bad ice harvest, they could then go at least 2 seasons or so with the stock or reserve that was in the ice house itself.
So seasonally, there was only obviously a certain amount of months out of the year when you could actually harvest the ice, and then you'd have to store it the rest of the time. How did that all work?
They were always monitoring the ice and hoping that it would form as quickly as possible and try to get about 10 inches, at least 10 inches of ice on the lake. It seems like the optimal amount for here in Northwest Connecticut was about 12. There are some lakes up in Massachusetts that could sometimes get like 16 inches or 18 inches thick ice, and maybe even more in some places further north. So the ice season generally lasted about 8 weeks. Start maybe like in January. There'd be enough cold temperatures that preceded it, and then the ice would start to form in, say, December, but it would get thick enough to be commercial quality sometime around January. And then they would harvest every day of the week. It was a 7-day-a-week operation. 15-hour days to move as much ice into that ice house as fast as possible and to store it safely so it wouldn't fall over because it was 3 stories tall, and then be able to get that 40,000 tons of ice each winter. Local farmers would come here and work at the ice house. It was a time of year when farming didn't really have a lot of commodity coming off the farms. There wasn't a whole lot of milk being produced. They weren't laying a lot of eggs at the time in the wintertime. So it was a time when the farm could use a little extra income. And so local farmers were coming here to work as well. But there was a unique feature of this ice house, and that was that there was dorms, which we don't normally see in most ice houses. It seems like we needed to get a workforce here, and they came from New York City, and they lived and ate on site so that they could get a longer work day out of the men and be able to get as much ice into the ice house.
But financially, they were kind of tied to the company too, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, they were. Because, I mean, by living there and working there, they were paying for room and board, basically. They also had to pay for that first train ticket to get from New York City to the lake station up here in Litchfield. And so as soon as they arrived, they were in debt to the company, and they had to work off that debt.
I want to talk about the actual operations, and I want to split it into 2. One, what they did on the lake, and then the second one, how they got the ice into the warehouse. So let's start with the lake. You showed me some incredible tools that were human-powered and horse-powered at different points, but without going into great detail, give me a summary of how do you actually prepare ice on a frozen lake for movement into storage?
So the first thing you need to do is get the snow off the ice. There's a lot of snow in the wintertime up here in Northwest Connecticut. So they had specially designed plows. They didn't have all this high-tech weather forecasting equipment like we do today. They would always be keeping an eye on the sky. And they could forecast the weather outwards to maybe like 72 hours, 2 or 3 days. And that was great because they could just plow off enough snow just to work and get things done, but then know that maybe snow was coming in a couple days. So they wouldn't work beyond what they were capable of completing. So the next thing they had to do was lay out some lines because the blocks had to be uniform in size and consistent in that regard. And so they would score lines through the ice, but not all the way through. They had special plows, so to speak, that would score the line through the ice, and it was drawn by a horse. The next thing that they would do is they would break those scoring lines apart. At this ice house in particular, they had a specially designed gang saws, which were these giant circular saws that you could push a float of ice through in one direction, and then you would take the float and turn it 90 degrees, and then there was a second set of gang saws that they would push the float through the second set of gang saws, and then they would cut the ice up into blocks.
And these would be uniform then?
They would be all uniform because it's a commercial product. It also helped with storing the ice. So then those blocks would then get fed up to a conveyor belt. It was a giant conveyor belt. It was a giant incline. And it was referred to as the endless chain because it was just a great big chain that went around a bunch of wheels, and it would push the ice house or the blocks towards the ice house. But before it got to the ice house, it would go through a planer. This was to ensure that the blocks, again, were uniform. So they'd chip off the top layer of the ice, and then they would push that ice block into the ice house and store it into one of 14 different compartments that they had. This ice house was huge. I mean, it was 700 feet long. 110 feet wide.
I mean, that's longer than 2 football fields.
Absolutely. It was 3 stories tall. And in each compartment, they're stacking up this ice in such a way that it wouldn't fall over. I mean, it was really, even though there's a concrete foundation, it was a wooden structure. The ice would melt in the summertime as well. So it had to have special drainage. It had 2 rail lines on either side of it so that they could have rail cars on either side to unload the ice in the summertime and get it into the rail cars.
You told me an incredible story about how many rail cars they were loading up during the summer.
So generally speaking, they would load up a good 5 to 10 rail cars every day, but they were capable, and they could do this during the heat of the summer, 20 cars.
And this would go up the Chippewa line, which ran from Hollyville in Newtown to Litchfield, and then they had a turntable in Litchfield to turn the engine around. It would come back down, pick up the cars full of ice, and take them to market.
Take them to market, yeah. And every stop along the way also had an ice house as well. They were shipping this perishable goods. Dairy was a huge industry up here in northwest Connecticut, but meat and other perishable goods. So the rail companies also had their own ice houses. So they were taking ice and putting them into these special designed ice cars, and so that they could ship perishable goods down to New York City and other urban areas.
What were the end markets for all this ice? What did people use this for?
Well, the ice at the big ice house was the home for residential users in New York City. I'm sure there were some industry in New York City that needed a large quantity of ice at times as well. But this was not the only big ice house in the region. I mean, there were quite a few, almost 100 of them along the Hudson River, and there were several in northern New Jersey. There was a lot of ice going into New York City throughout the year. But yeah, this ice was being brought down to New York City in 200-pound blocks, and then it was being distributed by a network of delivery men, whether it be horse-drawn carriages or trucks, that would then take the ice block and cut it up into smaller units. You at your house would have this card that had numbers on the corners of it. There'd be 25, 50, 75, and 100 in the corners, and you would hang up the corner at the top that you wanted. If you wanted 25 pounds of block of ice or a 100-pound block of ice, and the Iceman would then bring that amount of ice to your ice box, and they would put it inside the ice box for you. So quite often people's ice boxes were on their porches. It was to make it easier for the Iceman to deliver ice, or they would put it right near the door inside the house.
Now, the other thing that amazed me is how they kept it from melting, because the first thing you think of is, okay, fine, you're doing this in January and February. What happens when you get to August? How did they do that?
In the big ice house, they used either sawdust or hay as the primary insulation. And they would put about 12 to 18 inches thick of sawdust or hay on top or around the unit. This was a decent insulator. It was readily available and pretty cheap to find. Back in the early 1800s and mid-1800s, local dairy farmers were experimenting with all kinds of things. They used charcoal, they used tan bark. Tan bark's kind of cool because it's the bark that's used as a commodity for tanning leather. And in this area, that was primarily eastern hemlock. And so they would take the bark from eastern hemlock, and they had piles and piles and piles of tan bark after trying to tan leather. And they would use that as an insulation. It probably worked pretty well, but there was only so much that they could get. Eventually, they settled on hay or sawdust, probably because there's just a lot more of it in the area. There were a lot of local sawmills. Lots of hay was being harvested off the fields, and it worked as a really good insulator at the same time.
The other fact that just floored me when I read about it was the fact that ice was the number 2 export, second only to cotton, from the United States in the late 1800s. I had to rub my eyes and read that again.
There was a really interesting entrepreneur in 1806. His name was Frederick Tudor, and he was out of the Boston area. He was a man of means, dropped out of college, wanted to start a business venture, and he started looking at ice. And people thought he was kind of a crackpot at the time. So he harvested ice, put it in a boat, and took it down to Martinique. Eventually, it took off. It became like the in thing to have ice in your gin and tonic in India. And he was shipping ice from the Boston area all around the world to as far south as Australia. He was even shipping it to England. It became the in thing. Was ice from the Boston area was the in thing. By about the mid-1800s, about 1850s or so, the industry changed a great deal. There were a lot of competitors. There was a lot of other ice industry being developed. But also the ice industry started to change. Rather than it being something that the elite used, it was something that really was an industry that was very important for the local farmers and for getting products from faraway places to urban areas, perishable products like fruits and vegetables, dairy, meat. It was also being used on an industrial scale in fermentation, beer making, and other kinds of commodities. So we started to see what is now referred to as our cold supply chain. I mean, we're getting grapes from Chile, and we're able to see a diversified diet as a result of this change in the cold supply chain. But here in the United States, it really was fostered by the railroad industry, bringing in meat from Chicago and food and perishable goods from all over the country and taking it faraway places like New Orleans and those kind of places around the country.
It changed our whole cultures to the point now where you can get a refrigerator, put your glass in the compartment up front, and push something and ice cubes come out in it.
Precisely. And artificial refrigeration, the advent of it was invented by a surgeon in Florida who wanted to be able to provide cold storage for medicines and blood, but also for cooling off patients. And then that became a whole era. We could go down the rabbit hole of air conditioning and how we live our lives in the summer, pretty much air conditioned 100% of our time.
Well, I think we're going to park that air conditioning topic for another day. To wrap up the ice portion of this story, the Berkshire Ice Company operation ended in 1927 because a fire struck the facility, and while the fire destroyed the wooden structure that held all the ice, there was so much ice in there that the ravaging fire didn't even melt at all. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. You know, ice harvesting on a lake is a dangerous undertaking, and at least one worker was killed in Bantam Lake over the years, and more than one horse fell in. Not quite clear how or if those horses were rescued. I want to thank James Fischer for being with us for this episode. He's the research director for the White Memorial Conservation Center in Litchfield. And if you have a chance, you absolutely have to drop by and see their Class A museum. It is just stupendous. The answer to this week's trivia question, it's in Northeast Connecticut. It's about 100 miles long, and Connecticut wouldn't be here without it. The answer, it's the Old Connecticut Path. That's right, a path, but not just any path, as you may have guessed. It is an ancient Native American trail from Massachusetts to Connecticut, and it is the trail that the very first settlers of Connecticut took when they came here almost 400 years ago. That'll be next week on Amazing Tales CT, when we'll have the gentleman who's pieced together the actual route and has hiked the trail himself. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.